Let's see. Let's see. Bear with me, folks. I'm just finishing setting up. We'll be getting started momentarily. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Sorry about last week. I was having a bit of a stomach issue. For those who are wondering, no, it wasn't anything serious. It certainly wasn't the dreaded coronavirus. I just was having stomach issues. I'm prone to them from time to time, probably mostly because I need to lose weight, which I'm working on. That said, we are back tonight. We're going to be talking about the poltergeist phenomenon. It's a rather interesting thing that goes back hundreds of years. I do want to give everybody an update as well. We are still working on the Night's Black Agents. We still need to get the video updated. It took a little longer than I thought not because of anything with the video, just things going on in the real world. Also, the next session's sort of up in the air because we're still short of player. If anyone out there is interested, please feel free to email me. Emails in the description, or will be in the description at the end of the episode. You don't need to know how to play role-playing games. You don't have to have any experience. We'll teach you. Okay, but that said, again, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am, of course, Kevin Mears, demonologist, paranormal investigator, and the Paranormal Encyclopedia. So, I had a conversation briefly a while back with a publisher, with a woman who worked for a publisher who actually was a psychologist with experience in parapsychology, particularly poltergeist phenomenon, which is what inspired me to talk about this subject. I also honestly just find poltergeists really interesting. People have this, I want to say misconception, or maybe misconception is not the right word. Lots of people have different ideas of what a poltergeist is. And what's interesting to me about that is in my personal opinion, everybody's right to some extent. So let's talk about the different ways that let me first talk about what the term poltergeist refers to, and then we'll talk about the different ways people describe or explain poltergeist phenomenon. So poltergeist comes from German. The word polter meaning noisy or mischievous, and the word geist meaning ghost or spirit. It's not really a type of spirit so much as an umbrella of related phenomenon. Normally, with what would be called the poltergeist case, objects move. You'll hear sounds, growling, grunting. You will hear knocking on walls, scratching noises. The big thing that separates poltergeist phenomenon from a traditional haunting is that in a proper poltergeist haunting, normally you never see a human form. You don't even see animal forms. What you'll see, if you see any sort of manifestation, excuse me, is like this black gray fog. It doesn't have a coherent form. This sort of phenomenon's been reported for hundreds of years. In the Middle Ages, and for that matter, up in the colonial era and times like that, when people talked about poltergeists, they generally saw them as a type of demon. They've also been seen as ghosts. They've also been seen as one of the most famous poltergeists of all time, the Bell Witch, who actually did speak, which is less common, but you do see some cases that are considered poltergeists where the spirit will vocalize. But that one claimed to be a witch, among other things. So the question is, what causes poltergeist phenomenon? Now, the parapsychologist's answer, usually, it depends on the parapsychologist, obviously, is what's called spontaneous recurrent psychokinesis. Psychokinesis is, at least hypothetically, the ability to move objects with the power of your mind alone. This, for example, would be what Uri Geller, the guy who famously bent spoons with the power of his mind, except, of course, that he was a stage magician. But that would be what he was supposedly doing when he was bending those spoons. It's the power of the mind. It's also sometimes called telekinesis. So the theory is that some people, usually people in an emotional crisis, particularly people around the age of puberty, when everybody's hormones are out of whack, because of puberty, and it throws your emotions into a tailspin, they release this internal psychic energy that they have unconsciously. They're not aware of it, and it wreaks havoc in the environment around them. So that's one common explanation for poltergeists these days, particularly in the scientific crowd. Another explanation we'll hear from more occult circles is that poltergeists are ghosts. It's the spirit of a person that's moving objects around. There's of course the religious answer to the subject, which is it's demons, because, well, let's face it, to a certain subsect of Christianity, everything paranormal is demons. And then there's another possibility that it's another type of spirit, which is probably what I'm going to focus a lot of this episode on, which is elementals. Elementals are supposed to be a very old type of spirit. In the medieval and later texts that have been written about them, they're seen as God's first creation, even before the angels. They were given the job of protecting and watching over the natural world. It means they're very powerful and very dangerous and very unstable. And of course, they're traditionally tied to the four classical Greek elements: earth, air, fire, and water. I don't know. I honestly don't know, because I've been asked this before, if there's an Asian equivalent for the the 5 elements in China and other places like that. I suspect there probably is something similar. But so the question becomes, who's got the right answer? Which of these various sundry explanations is the correct one? I would submit to you that, in my personal opinion, all of them are correct, depending on the circumstances. Again, poltergeist isn't a category of spirit. There is. If you run around to all the spirits in the world and said, "So what are you?" I'm an angel. I'm a demon. Oh, I'm a poltergeist. No spirit's going to call itself. Probably not going to call itself a poltergeist. It'd be a ghost, an angel, demon, whatever. It's just, again, it's a label we stick on this related set of phenomenon, not a cause of a phenomenon. And which one you're looking at, you want to look at what's going on. In most, even what little recorded examples of psychokinesis and telekinesis there have been, and these are dodgy to say the least, it's very light things that are moved, things that are within a couple of pounds. That might get kicked up a little in the subconscious thing, just because tapping into what you don't know you have, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, weights aren't going to be extraordinary. The other big difference is signs of intelligence. Psychokinesis is going to be run by the subconscious, so one would not assume it's going to be very deliberate and something you can necessarily hold a conversation with. Ghosts, you're going to start to run into more of an intelligence, but again, the power levels are very weak. Human spirit hauntings, which is what I mean when I say ghost, don't have a lot of mojo, as it were. Usually, again, you're talking about objects within the 1 to 10 pound range. When you're talking about something inhuman, which would be your demons and your elementals, you're talking about extraordinary weights. if the phenomenon in the house is throwing refrigerators across the room, a couple 100-pound oak wooden chairs, and that's actually taken from an actual case. Some of this is being taken from actual cases. You're outside of the realm of ordinary human spirit phenomena and outside the realm of psychokinesis. That doesn't make it a demon. Although at this point, this is a common thing that I've gotten into discussions with people in the past about, well, how do I know it's an angel? How do I know it's a demon? How do I know it's a whatever? When I say it isn't necessarily a demon, I mean it's not necessarily a fallen angel. When I say demon from an investigator standpoint, I'm not approaching it from a highly taxonomical standpoint. My question is far more, is it some sort of malevolent entity that is working in the person's life? If it is, I kind of hang the demon label on it and go on with my day. From a how do I fix the problem standpoint, whether it's an elemental, a demon, or a fairy, or something, or whatever, isn't especially relevant. You'll get it's a common question I've been asked. For example, well, what if it's a Japanese demon, or China, or a Muslim jinn, or whatever, or some other thing other than a Christian demon? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. The prayers and things that work because of the faith behind them is what gives them power. It's what gives them energy. The spirits, in my experience, care more about do you believe in what you're saying than which particular name you tack on to God. Or what particular name you give what they are. Certainly there is an importance to names in understanding and learning its true name. But that's true for a lot of different types of spirits. It's not unique to demons. But let me talk a little more about the elemental side of this, which is, I think, where it gets interesting. In the really crazy end of poltergeist cases, you get a lot more than objects getting thrown around. In fact, traditionally, high-end poltergeist phenomenon often has an elemental link. You will have houses where fires simply, spontaneous combustion, fires start up out of thin air for no obvious reason and disappear just as quickly. You will have houses where it literally rains inside of the house. And I don't mean a plumbing problem. I mean actual, in some rain pouring down. Another common one that is very interesting, I think, is rain of stones. Charles Fort, the famous explorer of the weird, I think is probably the best way of putting it, talked about houses that were pelted from the sky with stones. Where this gets more interesting is people who live through this kind of phenomenon often report it isn't just pelting them from up on high, it's falling inside the house. But what's crucial here is you think, oh, okay, the stones are punching holes through the roof and hitting people. No damage to the house. Stones are just simply falling from the ceiling. And finally, you'll get ones where you have what sounds like and what appears to be small internal tornadoes inside of a house. Objects getting thrown around, sounds of great wind, roaring winds, things of that nature. You'll notice, of course, earth, air, fire, water. From what I've studied and from other investigators I've talked to, it seems like a lot of extreme poltergeist cases are these spirits we call elementals. Which raises some interesting questions. As I said, it's generally hypothesized that elementals were the very first things that God created. Or at least after he created the physical world, he created the elementals and then created the angels. That raises the obvious question. If God created them, why are they wreaking havoc in people's lives? Angels don't, as a rule, just show up and start smashing your furniture. Why do poltergeists do? Well, why do these types of poltergeists do that? Here's the thing: elementals are supposed to have been created for just like angels, just like people. Elementals were created with a specific purpose. They are guardians of the natural world. The places you run into them the most often are out in the woods, not inside somebody's house. That said, their job is to protect the natural world. Think for a moment about how humans treat the natural world. Can you see why they might not be real happy with us? When we pollute the air, we dig up the and overturn the earth to build things. We pollute the waters. The only elemental that really does well in the humans world is fire, because our combustion engines depend on it. But fire is itself a fairly destructive element in its own right. You don't look at fire and go, "Oh, look," granted there are uses for fire, but a fire running amok is generally something dangerous. Whereas actually any element running amok, I suppose, a stream, a flood, a hurricane, things of that, tornadoes, things of that, earthquakes, things of that nature. But fire is generally, by its nature, a fairly violent element. So they tend to dislike us, or they tend to wreak havoc on principle. This is also, by the way, why poltergeist cases tend to be fairly difficult to get rid of. Elementals have a significant amount of power behind them. You can still get rid of them with faith. Sometimes, and very often, there are other ways of dealing with it, by acknowledging what it is and trying to work with it. And I'll come back to this thought in a minute. But they can still be cast out. But again, elementals aren't necessarily tremendously common. Their jobs don't involve our world. They involve the industrialized world. They involve the natural world. A direct consequence of all of this, and really a subclassification of what could cause a poltergeist phenomenon, is fairies. Fairies are deeply tied to elementals, both in folklore and just conceptually. They are spirits of that are tied to the natural world in some mysterious way. There are a ton of, and I'll come into this in a second, because there's a whole bunch of theories about where fairies came from. Along with the simplest, which is simply that they're a subclass of elemental in some sense. But fairies and elementals are parts of the natural world. They serve a specific purpose. And usually when they start wreaking havoc in a human's life, it's because the human did something to upset them. Hey, Teresa Hall, Gold City Pagan. Thanks for joining us. Teresa says that she loves the Fae. I can't say that I love them. I don't hate them. I'm just very cautious about them. The thing... Okay, let's talk about fairies, since we're on the subject of elementals. People have and Teresa, having spoken with you before, I do not mean you. I'm sure you're better informed than the average person, but people have a tremendously skewed idea of what a fairy is, thanks to movies. When people think of fairies, a lot of times you think of the cute little winged pixies like Tinkerbell, or you think of leprechauns, which is a type of fairy, but it's not nearly as cute and funny as and benevolent as movies have made it out to. People have this very tend to see fairies as trickster type figures, which is fair, and playful and mischievous, and not necessarily malevolent. Fairies are not inherently evil. They're not necessarily inherently good either. They have their own agendas, they have their own goals, and they have their own purposes. And woe-betide humans piss them off. violating the rules that they work by, and those rules can be very strange and convoluted, can get you in all kinds of trouble. This does lead to a very good story before I get further into fairies, but it gets into what I was saying about sometimes there are solutions to poltergeist phenomenon other than exorcism. Um, my one of my mentors, the late Father Joe, recounted the story to me some years back about a country club down in Delaware. This country club had a bar, and every night they would, put the tables up on the chairs, wipe everything down, tables on chairs, turn off all the lights, lock the doors, go home. The next day, they'd come back. Tables and chairs were all moved around by some invisible force at night. What was interesting about this is it was a very specific pattern, like a big circle around the bar, almost like people were going to march in circles. Night after night after night, the same thing happens over and over and over again. They got a hold of Father, and Father actually, instead of rushing out to perform an exorcism, got them in touch with the folklorists familiar with particularly Irish folklore, who offered an alternative suggestion. He suggested that they take the big undeveloped area in front of the bar and turn it into a garden. Very beautiful natural garden with fountains and plants, and just make a monument to nature, as it were. They did this, and all the problems they were having at the bar stopped. They respected the spirits that were present, and the spirits weren't pissed off anymore. Another solution that's been offered, and the first one was a very good solution. I'm certainly not suggesting otherwise, but another possible solution would have been rearrange your seating diagram to leave room for this processional. Because if you read a lot of folklore, it is a thing that fairies will at night, go out and march in weird patterns and circles and things like that, and disrupt things of man that get in the way. So the easy solution, and certainly less expensive than building a garden, was just give them what they clearly want. But I'm a big fan of gardens, so I think that was a great solution too. Teresa also pointed out that her granny taught her to work with them as a child. You must be very careful with them. I couldn't agree with you more. The thing to understand, again, about fairies is fairies have rules. Fairies have codes of honor, I think it's fair to say, and they expect people to be very, very polite, but in very, very specific ways. Which is where you can get in trouble is offending them or breaking their rules without even knowing it. The one that most people know these days, thanks to the story of Rip Van Winkle, and other legends, and for that matter, the story of Hades and Persephone, even though neither is a fairy, don't eat their food. In general, though, be very cautious visiting fairy, because time passes differently there. You may, Rip Van Winkle famously fell asleep among the fairies, and when he woke up, 100 years, something like 100 years had passed. Which is the other consideration is, again, not malevolent, but their way of looking at the world isn't our way of looking at the world. And my best advice to anyone who wants to get involved with fairies is be very polite and be very cautious. And probably do a whole lot of research first. And if you think you've done enough research, then you're probably better off doing more research. Anything with the paranormal, it is always better to be more educated than less. Teresa says, Granny believed that your garden thrived with fairies, but you must respect them and plant things just for them, which is a traditional part of fairy lore. That in Europe, and here's the interesting thing about these legends, is that they survive in parts of Europe to the point there are people that still do some of these things. They don't even entirely understand why. One traditional thing to do is if you're a farmer and you're growing crops in a field, you set aside a part of your crops for the fairies. You don't touch it. You don't eat it. You leave it there for them to have. If they don't take it, that's fine, but you leave it, that you don't mess with it. It's a question of treating them with respect. Another very classical thing to do with fairies is you leave out milk, honey, bread. You'll still find parts of England in particular where people leave out milk, honey, and bread. They may see it as for the fairies, they may see it for the spirits, they may just do it because that's what they were told to do by mom and dad. If you seem to have one in your house, I think it is an excellent idea to consider all of these ideas. By the way, so an interesting question that I've seen with fairies, and as much as anything, I think it's more interesting to consider what all the different answers people have given over the centuries, even more than the question itself, which is, where do fairies come from? An obligatory smart aleck answer of, when a mama fairy and a daddy fairy love each other very much. But more seriously, where did the first fairy come from? One explanation, as I said, would be that they're elemental spirits. A more anthropological explanation for them is that they are pagan gods. That over time, and as Europe became increasingly Christianized, became this lesser classification of being. What you see here is this idea of animism, that plants, rocks, animals have a soul, and that you need to honor that spirit. So, what was maybe at one time the protector of that forest, or maybe that particular sacred oak, the god of this tree, this important tree that provides fruit for your village and helps feed you, has a minor god associated. Christians come along, there's only one god. Well, that's the fairy that's job it is to protect that tree. Another explanation that I've always found interesting is that they're the souls of the dead. More specifically, they're the souls of the dead before Christianity came to Europe. People who weren't, or even after that, they're the souls of people who were never baptized. The idea being, well, these people aren't evil. These people aren't wicked enough that they should be condemned to hell, but they never accepted Jesus Christ, so they're not worthy to go to heaven. So what happens to them? Well, they stick around and they become these fairies. This is also an idea you see to some extent with less Christian influences. For example, in Ireland, there's the idea of the Tuatha De Danann, who were this people that existed before the Celts, before most of the other groups of Ireland were there. They're just this older people that are now hanging around and have this magical quality to them. There is, of course, the standard Christian explanation for everything that I've already mentioned, and I completely disagree with, which is it's demon, which isn't really accurate. There is clearly a demarcation of spirits here, in my opinion, because demons are naturally destructive. Fairies tend to be mischievous, but they're not necessarily. But mischievous and evil are not the same thing. It's the idea of playing pranks, and especially treated with respect, fairies can even be helpful. There are there's the story of the elves and the cobbler, where the cobbler goes to sleep at night and the elves do his work for him. And there are stories like this. And they don't involve that classic deal with the devil where you have to help your soul and commit a wicked act to get the benefit. You have to treat them with respect. You often have to leave some sort of gift or offering to them. Milk, honey, food, clothing, things of that nature. But it isn't like it's going to bite you in the rear end. You're not going to be damned to hell. for this to happen. And let's be clear, these ideas survived well into Christian Europe. This wasn't just, well, the pagans used to believe this, and then Christianity took over, and everyone accepted they were demons. That's not how they were perceived. Then there's the other theory, which is where things get weird, in my opinion. Where they get really weird. There's a school of thought in Christianity that there are three groups of angels. There is holy angels, which are the angels that are loyal to God. When the second group, the fallen angels, when Lucifer had his great rebellion and declared that I will be like the Most High, I will set my throne above the heavens, and so forth, and God said, nope. They're the angels that were loyal to God and fought with Michael against Lucifer. There are, of course, the fallen angels, Lucifer and the angels that followed him in open rebellion against God and were cast into hell. Then there's the third group. One term for them, term that I picked up from role-playing game I've always kind of liked, was that they're not the fallen, they are the tripped. In this case, specifically, the idea is the war in heaven breaks out. And some of the angels look at the whole thing and go, I don't want anything to do with this. They weren't evil. They didn't side with Lucifer. They didn't rebel against God. But they refused, for one reason or another, they refused to fight. Maybe they're pacifists. Maybe they didn't want to turn against their friends and their brothers. Maybe they saw, I've seen it suggested they saw both sides as the same thing. The war ends. Michael curb stomps the devil. And then goes for distance and sees just how far he can throw him, creating hell. And there's a problem. The tripped, as it were, aren't loyal to God. Are found, at least, not to be loyal to God, so they can't stay in heaven. But they're not evil. They didn't rebel against God. They don't seek to set themselves up as gods. They don't seek to, when humans show up, they don't necessarily seek to kill us all or damn us all. So they don't really deserve hell either. So what do you do with them? In some versions of the story, they get kicked to Earth. And that's where fairies come from. To give you an idea of how prevalent this idea is, my friend, so any of you who have read my friend Patrick Thomas's stories will notice that he uses this particular explanation of the origin of fairies. And if you haven't read Patrick's books, I highly recommend them. He's an excellent author who does his homework. But the other thing that you'll run into in this case, with this theory, is it actually shows up in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. So you have the three books of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. In the Inferno, you have the first circle of hell, Limbo. And in Limbo are the virtuous pagans, people who were good and moral people, but weren't Jews and died before ever hearing about Jesus Christ, either because he hadn't been born yet, or they lived in, they were Native Americans living here while all that happened in the Middle East. They aren't being punished, but they can't go to heaven either. One of the other groups that you find here is the undecided. Particularly, it talks about these angels, the angels that refuse to take sides in the war. That they show up down there. So certainly, it's an old solution to the question. As to, I suppose, the obvious question at this point, which is, what do I think? Where do I think fairies came from? And a good question deserves an honest answer, so I will give you my honest answer. I don't know. I happen to like the idea of the tripped angels. I'm inclined to think that there are angels like that somewhere. Not necessarily saying that they are fairies. I'm not saying, I'm not saying they're fairies. I'm not saying they're not fairies. I don't know. I just think they're out there. Maybe for that matter, they're elementals in general. I also think that the elemental argument has a great deal of truth to it. Because again, fairies are very much tied to the natural world and to the natural order. But all of this leads to another interesting point. So I've mentioned several times at this point, fairies are not necessarily the pleasant creatures people think they are. There is an interesting idea there. One of the things fairies are associated with in folklore is kidnapping. Particularly, they tend to kidnap children. But not always. Sometimes they kidnap adults. Now, if you read older accounts of fairies, they tend to fly around at night. They tend to appear as balls of light. They tend to fly in chariots. They kidnap people. The people they kidnap experience time distortions in their perceptions of time. What feels like mere minutes passing for them, and then they come out of it, and hours or days have gone by. Or the other way around, for that matter. For that matter, another very common part of fairy folklore is that they reproduce with humans. This is a very sad part of fairy folklore, because even up into the 1900s, there are documented instances of people being killed because they thought because their husband thought that they were half fairy, or their wife, but mostly, of course, because misogyny being misogyny, usually it's the husband thinks the wife is. Sometimes it's this idea that people are sometimes kidnapped by fairies and replaced with a fairy, so they get killed for being this fairy. But here's the thing: does everything I just said, flying devices, lights in the sky, weird sexual practices with humans, any of this ringing a bell? Because here's another place where poltergeists and fairies intersect with something else that's weird. If you read accounts of alien abduction, they have every trait I just listed, and one more I didn't, because I like dramatic pauses. From time to having talked to the 3 or 4 ufologists on the planet, I don't think are crazy. No offense to anyone who's interested in UFOs. In my experience, UFO believers are some of the nuttiest people you'll ever meet. But there are some extremely competent and intelligent ones. There was a great one we had on the show way back in the day, Kurt Sutherland, who I would love to run down and get an interview with again. I've been trying for some time now. I don't know what happened, and even his publisher doesn't know how to get a hold of him. It's unfortunate because he lives in Pennsylvania as well, where he used to. But sometimes, maybe not every time, but sometimes in places where alien abductions have been reported, or where close encounters, the fourth kind, I want to say, or the fifth kind, no, third kind. Close encounters of the third kind. Close encounter of the third kind is the one where you actually see the aliens. But poltergeist phenomenon is often described. Objects moving on their own. For that matter, fairies move through solid objects. Fairies can move things with the power of their mind. Both traits usually associated with spirits, not physical beings. There is the argument, of course, sufficiently advanced technology. Arthur C. Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But one other thing to consider: tall, thin, very beautiful, a little bit like elves, or the Sidhe, which are the British equivalent of elves. Short, squat, kind of ugly-looking, grayish, big eyes. Not that different from dwarves. The whole reptilian thing sounds straight like demons. 100 years ago, well, longer than that, but if you go back before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and the other major science fiction writers since, nobody talked about aliens. Nobody believed in aliens. That isn't to say that UFOs weren't reported. That isn't to say that people didn't claim to be abducted. But when they were abducted, when they saw UFOs, they didn't call it space aliens. They didn't have this idea of life on other planets for the most part. What did they call them? They called them fairies. A 19th century or 18th century description of fairy abduction reads a lot like a description of a UFO abduction. And if you go further back, they have other, further back than that, demons did it. Further back, gods did it. Now, the common explanation among people who believe in UFOs is that all of these other things that people have been reporting for thousands of years are aliens. I don't agree. First, let me be clear, because people endlessly misunderstand me on this point. I am not saying that we are the only living things in the universe. I'm not even saying we're the only intelligent living things in the universe. I think it's extremely likely that in the entire vast reaches of even our own galaxy, other intelligent life exists. I don't buy the idea that it's ever come here. Or that if it has, we ever encountered it. You gotta understand, we've been, on the grand scheme of Earth's clock, we have been here for a fraction of an eye blink of a second. On the universal clock, we haven't reached that point yet. We've been here such a short period of time. The universe is around 14 billion years old. An entire civilization like our own could have risen, reached a point even higher than our own, and destroyed itself in nuclear Armageddon before the first Homo erectus ever stood up and took a walk. For that matter, intelligent life may happen 1 million years after we blow ourselves to kingdom come. Or for that matter, there may be intelligent life right now so far away that we have no idea it's there and it has no idea we're here. There are enormous problems with traveling through space. That's not even getting into the enormous problems of the fact that the very nearest star to Earth would be Proxima Centauri, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.4 light years from Earth. The speed of light is at the moment theoretically impossible to circumvent. None of this means that aliens have never visited Earth. I could very well be wrong. But what I am proposing is that what people think is aliens is something we've known for a very long time and given other names. That it's some type of spirit being. Quite possibly, it's fairies. One of the reasons I always liked Kurt Sutherland, for that matter, is that he agreed with me. He, unlike myself, believed that some examples of UFOs actually were legitimately aliens from another world, and that may be true. I have a broad enough view of all of this that I'm not saying that it's either or. It could be both. It could be something else I haven't even guessed at. And none of this is even taking into the possibility that it, or the very real percentage of these cases that are human imagination, deception, or others, sleep paralysis, or any one of a dozen other natural phenomenons appearing to be supernatural, something supernatural or alien. But I think it's worth considering the possibility that in our arrogance, and I think it's actually fair to call it that, we're assuming that we know better when we call this phenomenon a space alien. Maybe older people had the right idea, and we don't. It certainly would explain some of the things about these descriptions that are inconsistent with it being a biological life form like ourselves. Again, hardly. I definitely an area where I admit I don't know. I've never met a space alien. I've never seen a UFO. I could be completely off base here. But I think it's something worth considering. A book I would recommend that people check out. I don't agree with many of his conclusions, but I think he has a legitimate point here. Is John Michael Greer wrote a book called Monsters and Investigators, a Hunter's Guide, or Investigator's Guide. And then they recently, it was published by Llewellyn Publishing, and it was recently reprinted with even more information. And he actually points out, by and large, he's the person who really clued me in on the link between aliens and fairies. Before that, I had been just generally skeptical of the alien thing. But he has some interesting things to say on the subject and a lot of other subjects. Like, for example, dragons. Do they actually exist? And if they do, is that maybe what's hanging around Loch Ness instead of some ancient plesiosaur that somehow survived millions of years in a lake entirely too small to support a breeding population of them? Particularly given some of the aspects of dragon folklore and descriptions of encounters with Nessie. For example, the oldest recorded encounter with a monster of the sort, which happened in the River Ness, not Loch Ness, was a saint, 4th, 5th century, I want to say. I'm forgetting the saint's name. I'm not going to look it up right now. But basically, who saw the monster rise out of the water to attack a swimmer, and he simply said a prayer, and it sank back beneath the waves. For that matter, why have we never found even a dead body of Nessie? In a lot of dragon folklore, when dragons die, they dissolve, they vanish without a trace. It's something to consider. The world is, needless to say, infinitely weirder than people think. Certainly, there are other things he says that I think are off base. Another good example, because it relates to tangentially, since arguably they're the type of fairies. He makes a case for the existence of mermaids. I don't really agree. I don't think there's enough good evidence or reliable witness accounts for that. That said, they certainly aren't manatees. So real brief, because I think I'm going to get going in a minute. I think it's been a pretty good episode. But since I've gotten off on my tangent as I do, what explains mermaids? First, let's be clear. The explanation you've probably all heard since you were a kid, I certainly have, is that mermaids are manatees. This explanation is flatly ridiculous for several reasons. First of all, have you all ever seen a manatee? For one thing, they're huge. A couple of years back, when Amisha, my fiance, and I were in Florida, we went to the last time. We were actually just there this year. But we were in Florida, and we did Disney and Epcot. And when we were in Epcot, we went to their aquarium. And in the aquarium, they actually had a couple of manatees who had been injured by a boat. They were nursing back to health to re-release in the wild. I had no idea just how big those creatures were. I always figured it's probably, a little bit bigger than a dolphin. It's like, no, they're pretty big creatures. They also have whiskers and really aren't all that feminine looking. So why do people think manatees explain? And here's the other problem with that explanation, aside from the fact they don't look even remotely like women. You got to be really high up, really drunk on the grog if you think a manatee looks like a woman. Mermaid sightings are usually reported in the North Atlantic or the Mediterranean. Some of the oldest accounts of mermaids come from the Middle East. They come from the Norse cultures, Scandinavia. You know what you don't find in the North Atlantic and in the Mediterranean and the seas off of the Middle East? Manatees or dugongs. It doesn't make any sense, except in one instance. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but having researched the subject a little, it turns out that the original personal logs of Christopher Columbus, as I understand it, are lost. That said, his navigator kept a diary that we do still have hanging around. In it, he mentions the admiral, which is how he refers to Columbus, having visited the island of Hispaniola. Apparently, Columbus told the navigator that while there, he saw mermaids. But he was surprised because they were larger than he expected and far more masculine looking than they had expected. Now, what do you find in the waters around Hispaniola, which now would be modern day Haiti? Manatees. So in that specific instance, yes, I think the manatee adequately explains the mermaids. All of that said, there is an explanation for mermaids, and for that matter, probably for selkies, and similar phenomenon. And this is really rather interesting, in my opinion. See, if you're standing at water level or below it, just before a storm, you can get an optical illusion that affects the water. Particularly affects things floating in the water. A whale, a dolphin, a bit of driftwood. Distorts their appearance, can make them look human. Now let's put some clues together about this. One of the most common cultures to report sightings of mermaids were the Norse, the Vikings. Viking longships, the deck is actually below the surface of the water. So they're in exactly the right position for this optical effect. You can also see it from land. It's been reported around the Great Lakes. So we have ships that are at exactly the perfect place. Point 2. If you read mermaid folklore, seeing a mermaid, or especially hearing a mermaid sing, usually means a storm is coming. Now the thing about that, one, of course, whales and dolphins make some very musical sounds. Driftwood obviously does not. But my friend Drew Rosansky, who was the first co-host of the show, pointed something out to me I honestly hadn't known. In a storm, when you have heavy winds, it whips the rigging, the sails, the rigging, the ropes, and everything around on the deck. And that also can sound very musical. So, you have a storm brewing. You're low to the water. You see something in the water that's being distorted by this optical effect. That, ladies and gentlemen, be in my opinion, where the legends of mermaids actually comes from. Not from actual fish people. Not from manatees, for goodness sakes. But from this particular effect. This is important to note as well, because while it doesn't really relate to poltergeists, it's a good example of why skepticism is generally a good idea, you need to be careful at how you're skeptical. It is common for skeptics to look for the easy solution to a question that fits. The reality is, skeptics can be as biased as everyone else. But sometimes they will look for the first explanation that seems to fit the facts, and they stop there. The manatee explanation definitely fits where Columbus was when he saw them and what Columbus said about what he saw. It doesn't fit hundreds of years of accounts before what Columbus said. But skeptics being biased and lazy, stopped when they found the easy explanation. Went, see, there it is. Another good example of this, of course, is the Kraken or the giant squid. For hundreds of years, people insisted there was no such thing. I had one of my favorite teachers in high school, biology teacher, spent a lot of the time on and under the ocean, scuba diving. Adamantly insisted there was no such thing as giant squid. This was in the 90s. Obviously, in the early 2000s, they finally proved once and for all that, yes, giant squid exist. There's a lot of things in the world, and sometimes you have to look a little harder than stopping at the easy answer. But it's been a little under an hour. Logical monster cook, and I like werewolves. Feel free, of course, to contact me via Facebook or email in the description. If you have questions, comments, concerns, I hope everyone is staying safe with the coronavirus outbreak. Please, be careful out there. I would definitely suggest folks go to my friend Virgo Triad's channel. She's been keeping up to date on a lot of the information. She just did a town hall meeting with the senator and got a whole bunch of factual information about the stimulus package that finally just got approved. And she has a whole video on her channel with frequently asked questions, worth checking out. Remember, we are still working on the Knights Black Agents campaign. I am short a player. If anybody is interested, feel free to reach out to me via email. Email in the description. We're looking at this point at meeting online. It's an online thing. You don't have to meet in person. You don't have to come to New Jersey. But it's going to be on Saturday nights. And thank you, Teresa. I'm very glad that you enjoyed it. Again, if you don't know anything about role-playing games, don't worry. We will teach you. It's a lot of fun. Hopefully, I'm hoping we'll have the first episodes up soon. We still got that edited. But finally, just remember, if you can support us, please consider going to our Patreon link in the description below. If you're broke, and good Lord, do I understand that with the financial tailspin things are in right now with everything shut down. If you don't got money, the thing you can always do to help us out, like, share, comment, and subscribe. None of those things cost you a thing, but they all benefit me and the channel. Remember, you don't have to. If you don't like what I'm doing, feel free to dislike and tell me so. That's always welcome too. That's going to do it for tonight, everyone. I want to thank you all for listening. It's been a pleasure as always. This is Kevin Mears, your demonologist and paranormal encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless.